We're still looking at the life of Jesus Christ and His unique ministry. We're still technically in the book of Luke looking at Jesus. But a few weeks ago, I took a side road to look at the works of Satan as Satan tries to stop, or tried historically to stop, Jesus Christ from being born. We jumped forward into the ministry of Jesus, and I backed up to say, hey, wait, Satan tried to stop this. And so that's what we've been looking at, Satan's attempts to stop Jesus. And tonight we're going to start a trip through the Book of Esther. The Book of Esther, to show what is one of Satan's most successful schemes to destroy the seed of the woman promise and to destroy the nation of Israel. In the Book of Esther, we see just how close God let Satan get. It's not that Satan got this close. It's more proper to say we see how close God lured Satan in and how close God let Satan get to destroying all of Israel. If you've never read Esther, or if you haven't, you've never gone through it a little bit slower, there's only 10 chapters and we won't be here long. But I just want to take the time to go through some of these chapters and see the story, see how God foils Satan yet again. But first, there's always a first. Before we get into the book of Esther, we have to see how Esther fits into the Jewish timeline. We can't tell the story of Esther without understanding when it happened and what the significance of it is. What's the historical significance of this book, Esther? Why is the story of this one Jewish woman named Esther in a pagan land? Now make no mistake, as we start going through this and your mind starts preparing to learn about Esther, she's a Jew living in Babylon. She's a Jew living outside of the land. Her and her uncle Mordecai did not come back into the land after the 70 years. Now you can fault Esther. Let's start by saying this, already out of the notes. You can fault Esther, the woman, for a lot of things that we'll read in this story. But know for certain that God called Esther. Look at what her uncle Mordecai will say to her. That's this verse that's on the board. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. You hear that quoted a lot. I say it a lot, for such a time as this. We were called as Christians in America, 2022. God has brought our generation to the forefront as Christian leaders for such a time as this. When everything's chaotic, we're losing ground in America as conservative Christians. For such a time as this, God has had us born in this country. And there's no question when we get to Esther, for such a time as that moment when she saved Israel, that's why God brought her into that Persian king's harem. It's a very interesting story, but Esther is... there's some things we're going to talk about with Queen Esther by the time we get through this. But historical significance. I want to remind you of this. That come on, computer, what's going on here? There we go. A couple of thoughts before we go to that timeline. God, Yahweh, I always call Him by both names, His Hebrew name. The name He gave us is Yahweh. That's His covenant name, the name with which He enters contract. If God were to make an agreement with Israel, and He did, if He would have signed the contract, this is what He would have signed. This is His contract name. He's got many names, but this is the name with which He told Moses He would enter into covenant or contract or agreement with Israel. This is His covenant name, Yahweh. So Yahweh is satisfied when Israel worships Him only, following the Mosaic law. Only Israel worshiping only Yahweh, following only the Mosaic law, not making anything up. 613 rules He gave Israel. When they follow those rules, everything is perfect. Yahweh is satisfied when Israel worships Him only, following the Mosaic law. Satan, on the other hand, is satisfied every time Israel walks away from Yahweh to worship idols and false gods. This is a very important couple of statements to understand the timeline and what's going on when Esther hits the earth. When Esther comes on the human scene, you have to keep these two thoughts in mind. Yahweh is satisfied when Israel properly worships Him according to the Mosaic law, and on the other side is Satan, who's satisfied every time Israel doesn't worship only Yahweh, but instead turns to their idols and their false gods. So because of this idea that Satan is satisfied when Israel walks away, Satan is in the business of leading Israel into idolatry. Satan does that. You say, well, how does he do that? What do you mean Satan's in the business of leading Israel into idolatry? Because Satan develops all the world's religious systems and false belief systems and all the false gods. They're all satanically derived. Look at this verse. Look at what it says in the Psalms. Psalm 106 is a history of Israel. And look what it says in Psalm 106, verse 37 and 38. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. Who's he talking about? Who's they? They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood. Let me back up a little bit and tell me who the they is. They joined themselves to Baal of Peor and ate sacrifices made to the dead. Thus they provoked God to anger with their deeds, and the plague broke out against them. Then Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stopped, and that was accounted to Phinehas as righteousness. Who are we talking about? Israel. We're talking about the Jews. We're talking about God's called out nation, God's chosen nation, Israel. It says they angered him at the waters of strife, so that it went ill with Moses on account of them, because they rebelled against God's Spirit, so that he spoke rashly with his lips. They did not destroy the peoples. Who are we talking about? Who is going in with Joshua in the conquest? Who's supposed to be destroying the pagans? Israel. They did not destroy the peoples concerning whom the Lord had commanded them, but they mingled with the Gentiles and learned their works. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons. Who? Israel. The Jews. Remember this? Yahweh is satisfied when Israel worships Him according to the law. Who gains the satisfaction when Israel worships idols and false gods? Satan does. So the systems that Satan has developed, the religious systems, are what the Israelites, the Jews, fall into. It says here very clearly, they sacrificed their children to the demons. You notice it doesn't say to the false gods. It doesn't say to the idols. In Psalm 106, the psalmist gets very particular and very straight to the point and says, when you sacrifice to a false god, you are worshiping a demon. Because demons and Satan, who is a demon, are behind all of the false religious systems on the earth. I don't care what you call them. Again, you've got the Bible, you've got the truth of the Bible, and you've got everything else. And it doesn't matter by what name it's called. It doesn't matter how lovely the people that are stuck in that system are. They're sacrificing themselves to demons. They shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. So you see, the demons and the idols of Canaan are placed in parallel here. The idols of Canaan are demons. They're backed by demons. And the land was polluted with the blood. I say this, I bring up this verse. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in the first hour in Joshua on Sunday. But Satan leads the world in anti-God idolatry. And it's all demon energized. Satan also leads the world in anti-Semitism, a hatred of the Jewish people. And all of this we're going to see in the book of Esther. Mostly the anti-Semitic part and the destruction of Satan of Israel. But those are the things we're going to see. Now, Queen Esther the Jew. Remember, she's a Jew. She's a Jew living outside of Israel. The book of Esther, the story of Esther, does not take place in Israel. It takes place outside of Israel. It's not a Jewish story as far as geography. It's about the Jews, but it's not in Israel. And so Queen Esther the Jew comes to have influence in Persia at the perfect time in human history. Again, for such a time as this, because Israel needs to be saved from Satan, who is almost allowed to annihilate them. The book of Esther is about the annihilation of Israel by Satan. We'll talk more about Esther as we get into it, but the name God never appears in the book of Esther. Not the word for God, El, not the name for God, Yahweh. Nowhere in the book of Esther is God's name there. Nowhere in the book of Esther do we hear of Uncle Mordecai, who's a good guy, a good Jew, or Esther praying to God. They don't seek God's guidance. At least we're not told that they do by prayer. There's also a name that's not listed in the book of Esther, and that's the name of Satan. But I'm telling you, when the Jews are almost annihilated, Satan's always there. And when the Jews are saved from annihilation, God is always there. Simple enough? I say that because the book of Esther takes a beating from a lot of Christian scholars. There are several Christian scholars that don't believe the book of Esther should be in the Bible because of some of the things I just told you. God's name's not listed, prayer's not in it. They have problems with the book of Esther. I do not. It's been in the Bible for, let's say, 3,000 years now. If God wanted it out, He could easily erase it. It's a prophetic book. It's a biblical book. It's a God-breathed book. God the Holy Spirit wrote the book of Esther. To the timeline. I printed it out for you. If you don't have one, please tell me and I'll give you one. There's a lot to this timeline, and I know not everybody's a note taker. So I thought the best thing to do is print out this timeline, and maybe you can, if you'd like, scribble notes onto the timeline that'll help you remember what's going on. Now, I started in 1000 BC, and that's an approximation. But in around the year, very close to the year 1000 BC, King David reigns over Israel, for 40 years. I started with some good news. King David reigns over Israel for 40 years, and that makes God satisfied. Yahweh is satisfied with the reign of King David. Even though David has some struggles of his own with Bathsheba and some other incidents in his life, when God looks at King David, what is his estimation of the man? What does God say? A man what? When He sees David, a man after what? A man after my own heart. God was satisfied with the reign of King David. But by the time we go, 400 years down the road, God is completely dissatisfied with Israel and their worship of Him. They've turned away from God and they've begun to worship idols entirely. And in 605 BC, God begins to let the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar destroy Israel, the southern kingdom, Judah. Now let me back up just for a second. I didn't put it in here. Maybe I should have. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel goes out to Assyria. It's not a fact that's important to our story. But in 722 BC, the northern kingdom, remember the kingdom split? The northern 10 tribes, they go idolatrous. Remember, they didn't have a single God-fearing king. Nobody in the northern kingdom in their in their royal family, nobody worshiped God properly. He was unhappy with all of them. And so they were kicked out of the land of Israel much sooner than Judah was. So in 722, Israel is kicked out of the land. And so you go another 115 years or so before it starts to begin happening in Judah. Judah did not learn their lesson from Israel, from their brothers, their tribesmen, their fellow tribesmen. As sad as it is, Judah did not learn the lesson from the northern kingdoms. If we continue down this road of idolatry, God will kick us out of this land. It won't be good. They didn't learn the lesson. Ezekiel chapter 16, if you want to scribble down a chapter, Ezekiel chapter 16 is a fantastic chapter that talks about the fact that Judah was just as foolish as her sister Israel. And then we get to the next thing. So in 605 BC, Judah begins deportations to Babylon due to idolatry. Now what I mean by that is that's God disciplining Judah, the southern kingdom. And in 605, people start going to Babylon. It doesn't happen all at once. There are 3 deportations of Israel. This is what I mean by that. God took His time kicking Judah out of the land. It took God 20 years to kick all of Judah, all of the southern kingdom out of the land. He started in 605 BC. I wonder if it was grace before judgment. Like in 605 BC, we see somebody like Daniel perhaps, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the first group that goes down to Babylon. I wonder if those in Judah that were still in Jerusalem may have thought, we need to turn. We need to turn back to worshiping the one true God, forget all this idolatry, and maybe we can stop this. 20 years go by and they didn't get the picture. I wonder how long God will give America. You get the point? The thought? 20 years of grace. So in 605 BC, God begins to destroy the southern kingdom of Judah because they are idolaters, because they are worshiping demons instead of the one true God. 20 years go by, and in 586 BC, finally, Jerusalem is destroyed. God allows, it's over, grace is over, Jerusalem will be destroyed, the temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is completely destroyed by Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. And that's it for Judah. They're done. God has promised through a man named Jeremiah that Israel, when He kicks them out of the land, would be gone for how many years? 70. So here begins in 605 BC that 70-year count. Because that's when it started. That's when they started getting kicked out. Other people start counting from 586. Some count from... it doesn't matter. It's 70 years to the day. We know that because God knows how to count. But in 586, Jerusalem... Now, understand what that number means. That's 586 years before Jesus Christ was born. That's what we're talking about. 586 years before Jesus Christ is born in Bethlehem, Jerusalem, instead of the seed of the woman being maintained and being healthy, the seed of the woman is in disrepair, this promise of God, because Israel has been destroyed, Judah has been destroyed, Jerusalem has been destroyed because Israel and Judah walking away from God wholeheartedly. That's what happens in 586. So who's happy now? God or Satan? Who's happy now? In the first part, King David reigns over Israel for 40 years, a man after God's own heart. Happy God, unhappy God. Happy God. Happy Satan, unhappy Satan. Unhappy, doesn't like a thing about it. But what about in 605 BC? Now we're talking, Satan says. Now we're talking. If I can get them out of the land, if I can destroy some of this empire that God has built, maybe I can start to unravel all of Israel and destroy them, wipe them off the planet. 605, Judah begins falling to Babylon. Satan's happy. 586, he's ecstatic. Jerusalem is destroyed by Babylon, and that makes Satan happy. But in 538, because God always wins. God always wins. Hold on to that every day you breathe. It doesn't matter what's going on. God always wins. Jesus Christ sits as the victor, simply waiting for the Father to make His enemies a footstool for His feet. Jesus has already won. We're not in this Star Wars struggle between good and evil where we don't know who's going to end up the winner. None of that is true. God's already told us eternally that He has won and Jesus has won. They're already the victor here. And in 538, Cyrus, the king of Persia. Now that's an interesting name or word. I want you to, on your notes, circle Persia, because this is where Persia is modern day what? What country? Iran. Iran. Persia is Iran. I've told you this before, but if you speak to an Iranian and call him an Arab, he will very quickly correct you and say, "Sir, I am not Arab, I am Persian." They're proud. The Iranians are proud. Up until the 1980s, Iran wasn't a bad place to be. It was the Muslim Brotherhood that came into Iran in the late 80s that destroyed the country. But Cyrus is the king of Iran. He's the king of Persia, and this is where the story of Esther takes place, in Persia. So Cyrus, this is not Esther's husband, but this is a different king. In 538, Cyrus, the king of Persia, is appointed by God to send Jews back to the promised land to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Why is that? 605 minus 538. You know how many years? 67. Takes them a couple of years to build the temple. By the 70th year, worship is reinstated in Israel, in Jerusalem. That's what we're dealing with here. The 70 years are up. So God appoints the king of king of Persia, named Cyrus, to send the Jews back. I told him I would exile them for 70 years. It's been 70 years. It's time for my people to be back in the land that I gave them. I love that God of ours. It's time to go home. And he lifts up Cyrus, the king of Persia, and has Cyrus make a decree to send the Jews back to the promised land to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Now, a couple of verses. Look at the verses. In Ezra chapter 1 and 2. Yeah, I hope by the end of this night, I hope you'll say, you know what? The Bible is not as difficult a book as I thought it was. You know, you have all these names, Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, Haggai. Who are all these prophets and what do they have to do with the story of Israel? They just have a part in the play, that's all. They just have a part in the play. It's all about Jewish history, how the Jews go from getting the Mosaic law to getting the king, King David, to falling away from God in idolatry, going into Babylon for 70 years, coming back into Babylon, and then we get to Queen Esther. It's just, and you realize where Ezra fits into the story. Ezra is a prophet that wrote after the exile. Ezra is a post-exilic. He writes after the exile. His part of the Jewish story happens after the 70 years. Nehemiah, his part of the Jewish story happens after the 70 years. Haggai, his part of the Jewish story happens after the 70 years in Babylon. Zechariah, his part of the story happens after the exile. What about Isaiah? Was Isaiah before the 70 years or after the 70 years? He was before. What about Daniel? A trick question. Huh? He was in it. Daniel was in Babylon. So Daniel was a messenger, was a prophet of God during the Babylonian captivity. So all these people they're just part of the story, that's all. And look what it says about Cyrus being appointed by God to send the Jews back to the land that God gave them. In Ezra 1:1 it says, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Sound familiar? There's our guy, Cyrus, king of Persia. In the very first year he was the king, and we know what year that is. In order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. What was the word of the Lord through Jeremiah? 70 years. 70 years have been appointed for Israel. Since the 70 years are almost up, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, so that Cyrus sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put in writing, and this is what Cyrus said, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and He has appointed me to build Him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. You can't have worship back in Israel unless you have the temple of the house, unless you have the house rebuilt in Jerusalem. For Israel to go back into the land is of no value unless God's temple is rebuilt and they can worship God properly. The Mosaic law hinges on the Levitical sacrifices. The temple has to come first. So God starts by sending Cyrus in 538. Cyrus gives this proclamation that that Jerusalem will be rebuilt. The temple in Jerusalem will be rebuilt. Now, I'm going to show you a verse here, or not a verse, but a statement. Look at what it says here in this verse. Now, I'm going to ask a question and then we'll read it again. Does Cyrus worship God? Does Cyrus worship the God we worship? Is Cyrus a believer, an Old Testament believer in Yahweh? The first year of Cyrus, in order to fulfill the Lord's word, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus. And this is what Cyrus said, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He knows where the kingdoms came from, doesn't he? And God has appointed me, this Yahweh has appointed me to build Him a house in Jerusalem. Now, there is something that archaeologists found many, many years ago. And it's called the Cyrus Cylinder. It's this little bitty round thing. I actually think we saw the Cyrus Cylinder in a museum in Jerusalem. Little bitty. But on this Cyrus Cylinder, this is not Bible. This is King Cyrus having written on the cylinder about when he took over Babylon. Now this year 538, if you look at your timeline, I say 538, Cyrus is appointed to send Israel back. But that's not the first year of Cyrus's reign over Persia. You see, Ezra 1:1, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, this is the first year of Cyrus's reign over Babylon. He is the Persian king that's now conquered Babylon. And we're talking about his conquering of Babylon. So on this Cyrus Cylinder, this is what he wrote about when he conquered Babylon. Listen to what he wrote. Look at it there. He says, may all the gods... Oh, wait. Stop right there. How many gods are there? One. So now let's rethink Cyrus just for a minute. May all the gods whom I have resettled in their sacred cities, name one of those cities that we just mentioned that Cyrus says, I'm going to rebuild a temple to the God there in that city. Jerusalem. This is what he has to say about what he's doing. May all the gods whom I have resettled in their sacred cities daily ask Baal and Nebo for a long life for me. You know who Baal and Nebo are? That's not his mom and dad. These are two false gods of Persia. Backed by who? Satan and his demons. So the reason that Cyrus settled people back in the land, obviously God stirred the heart of Cyrus to where he thought, you know what, that's a good idea. Did he give him a dream? We don't know how he came to him. but God was in control of these things. But Cyrus wanted strong buffer states. He wanted strong buffer states in his empire who would be loyal to him. So if he lets all these people go back and worship their own gods, they will be loyal to Cyrus, was the thinking here. He also wanted people, as it says here, he wanted people to pray to their gods so that their gods could pray to his gods so that his gods could give him a long life. Now this is out of the mouth of King Cyrus, that quote right there. Because of that archaeological find, that Cyrus Cylinder. So it just makes you question whether Cyrus was a believer in Yahweh the way the Jews were. May all the gods strike one. Daily ask Baal, strike two, and Nebo, strike three to me. I hope he's in heaven. But not based on what he wrote, not based on this day for certain. So that's what we see. Cyrus, the king of Persia, and remember, I'm going somewhere with this. Stick with me. I got to tell this story, give this timeline, so I can land Esther at the proper place in Jewish history, or else it'll make no sense. 536. In 538, Cyrus says, Jews, go back and build the temple. 2 years later, which is year 69, the altar is built, but the temple is not completed. Now remember what the temple looks like. You've got this temple that stands 60 feet tall, and in front of it, outside of it, you have this brazen altar where the animals were slaughtered and burned. So they built the altar, but they didn't rebuild the temple. And so you have a man named Haggai. Have you heard of that book? The book of Haggai, the prophet Haggai. You have a man named Haggai who God brings up to say, go tell the people in Jerusalem to build my temple. I didn't send them back so that they can live in their houses of cedar and ignore my house. You go tell Israel to rebuild my temple. And that, friends, is the story of the book of Haggai. That's what Haggai did. That's how God used him. Look what God says to Haggai. Go up to the mountains, bring wood, and rebuild the temple, that I may be pleased with it and be glorified. Says Yahweh, you look for much, but behold, it comes to little. When you bring it home, I blow it away. They're not having success in the land. Why? Because they haven't rebuilt the temple, which is what Cyrus sent them to do 2 years ago. They're not worshiping God properly. And God says, why do I do these things? Because of my house which lies desolate, while each of you runs to his own house. So Israel, in beautiful Jewish form, they've gone back from Babylon, they've gone back into Jerusalem and Judah, and they've built their houses. They built a little altar, so God should be happy. Now we're going to go take care of our things. And they ignored the temple. And so God says, this is what got you kicked out of the land in the first place, you see? We're not going through this again. You build my house. So what do we see after this? As that in 520 BC, look how long it takes. 18 years have gone by since Cyrus the king said, go back and rebuild the temple. 18 years go by, and Haggai comes into Jerusalem to deliver his first message. Refocus on rebuilding the temple. Because the Jews just wouldn't do it. But we have good news after Haggai's message in Haggai 1:14. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah. Here we have this stirring up the spirit again like he did to Cyrus. But Zerubbabel is a good man in the line of Jesus Christ. And the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. And the spirit of all the remnant of the people. And they came and they worked on the house of the Lord of hosts, their God. And on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of Darius the king, the temple finally gets built. The temple finally gets built. They came and they worked on the house of the Lord. That is Haggai's message. Get back to work on the temple. Get back to work. And we also see another prophet of God at the same time, and that is Zechariah. Zechariah prophesies to Israel at the exact same time Haggai does. Now look what it said in this last verse. The 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of Darius the king. Now Cyrus is no longer the king. Now Darius is the king. And look what year it is. It's the 2nd year of Darius' reign when Haggai comes and they build the temple. Now look at this next verse. In the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius. We're talking about 2 months different. 2 months after Haggai chapter 1, Zechariah speaks. They're prophets at the same time, after the exile. And this is what Zechariah has to say. In the 8th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah the prophet, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, and this is what God said. The Lord was very angry with your fathers. That's why He kicked them out of the land for 70 years. That's what He's referring to. Your fathers, Israel, were idolaters. They didn't worship Yahweh. They worshiped everything but Yahweh. And so the Lord of hosts says, return to me. Come back and worship me. Worship me only. Worship Yahweh, that I may return to you. Now, isn't that an interesting statement? Return to me so that I may return to you. Who goes first? Who goes first? Israel goes first. Israel goes first. God's led them into the land. 20 years have gone by. 18 years. You still haven't built the temple. But you want me to bless you with all the blessings of the Mosaic law, yet you haven't built the temple. 18 years, no Passover. 18 years, no Day of Atonement. 18 years I've brought you back into the land. You have not returned to me. I'm waiting for you to return to me, and then I'll return to you. It's a very interesting statement. Any New Testament verse come to mind? Return to me that I may return to you. Man goes first, the Christian goes first, and then God will respond. I'm not talking about salvation. I'm talking about in the Christian walk. God says, if you want a relationship with me, I'm all for it. You start. No, that's not what I'm thinking about. In James chapter 4, verse 8, the New Testament says, draw near to God, and what? And He will draw near to you. Who goes first? Some things never change. If you want to worship me and have a relationship with me, son, I am all for it. Daughter, I am open-armed. But I've done everything. I'm waiting for you to respond. And if you'll respond properly to me, we'll have a loving relationship like you couldn't imagine. But you go first. And He tells Israel the same thing. Return to me, the Hebrew word shuv, S-H-U-B. Return to me so that I might return to you, because they haven't yet. So Zechariah prophesies at the same time. Zechariah the prophet. Another thing on the timeline, we're almost done. 516 BC. How many years have gone by? Cyrus the king of Persia, look at your timeline. In 538, Cyrus says, go back and rebuild the temple. Now we're in 516. That is 22 years. 22 years it took for Israel to rebuild the temple. Look what it says, 516 BC, the temple is complete. We read this in Ezra. In the book of Ezra, because Ezra was sent back to build the temple, Nehemiah was sent back to build the walls of the city. But in Ezra chapter 6, verse 14, and the elders of the Jews were successful in building through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. We just read those two verses. I just showed you from the book where Haggai prophesied, get back to focusing on rebuilding the temple, and Zechariah coming to say the same things. And finally, the great verse in Zechariah, and they finished building. But my goodness, 22 years. They finished building according to the command of the God of Israel and the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Remember that name? Persia, Iran. There it is again. This temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month, Adar. It was the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. However you want to say his name, I say Darius. 22 years Israel has been back in the land. 50,000 or so came back with Ezra, according to Ezra chapter 2. 50,000 people. That gives the exact number in Ezra chapter 2. It's like 49,897 or something. It's just about 50,000. I say 50,000 because that's plenty of people to rebuild the temple in less than 22 years. But finally, the temple is completed, the book of Ezra. And look at this next statement. In 486, exactly 100 years after Jerusalem was destroyed by Babylon, there's a man named Xerxes who becomes the king of Persia. This, friends, is Queen Esther's husband. Just trying to show you the timeline. Some of you may say, man, stop already. But my historian heart loves this stuff. I just love to know where I'm at on a timeline. It makes all the difference in the world when you read the Bible to know when you're talking about. Otherwise, it's just a cool story, but it doesn't have a historical significance. So Israel's been kicked out of the land for 70 years. They come back in the land. They've rebuilt the temple. Worship is reinstituted. They're in the book of Esther. They celebrate the Passover again after almost 100 years of not celebrating it. They celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem again. And here's a man in 586. His name is Xerxes, and he becomes the king of Persia. The name you see in the Bible is Ahasuerus. That's how most people pronounce that. A good Hebrew would pronounce it Ahashverosh. Ahashverosh. And me being a good Hebrew wannabe is going to pronounce his name Ahashverosh, because that's his name, Ahashverosh. And this is the name when we get to the book of Esther on Sunday night. This is what Esther 1:1 says. Now it took place in the days of Ahashverosh, the Ahashverosh who reigned from India to Ethiopia. In those days, King Ahashverosh sat on his royal throne, which was in the city of Susa. So this is the person, 586 BC. 100 years after Jerusalem is destroyed, the 70 years are up, the temple's completed, Israel's back in the land, they're worshiping God again, and Satan is on the prowl. Satan, the one who still prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour, is on the prowl for the seed of the woman and Israel. In 479 BC, 7 years after Ahasuerus becomes the king of Persia, Esther becomes the queen of Persia. She marries Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Now this Xerxes is not Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes was his child. This Xerxes is Ahasuerus, a different person than Arte, A-R-T-E, Xerxes. Different people, different kings. So we're in the land of Persia. I hope I've built that for you. We're in the land of Persia, modern day Iran. Esther, for whatever reason, has not... Now here's a problem with me and Esther. Only a problem because she should be back in the land of Canaan. She should have gone back when Cyrus said, Jews, go home. Why she stayed in Persia, I don't know, but God knew she would stay. God knew she was beautiful, and God knew she would attract the eyes of King Ahasuerus so that he would make her his queen. And that's what saves Israel. So God uses not only faithful servants to move his plan forward, he also uses crummy servants to move his plan forward, because after all, he's only got us to work with. And some days we're faithful servants, and some days we're crummy servants. But yet his plan goes forward. So just to put one more slide up here, in 483 to 473 BC, the Book of Esther takes place. Esther covers a 10-year period of Jewish history. From 483 to 473, the Book of Esther records 10 years of Jewish history, what God was up to, what Satan was up to, big time what Satan was up to. A fascinating story of just how close God allowed Satan to get. Now, this is a story that we'll get to certain chapters and you will say it's all over for Israel. It's finished. No one can solve this. It has been decreed by the king, and it cannot change that on a certain day every Jew shall die. And it can't be changed according to Persian law. But yet God does what God does, doesn't He? 483 to 473, the Book of Esther, just a couple of verses because I like proving things with the Bible. Look at what it says in Esther 1 verse 3. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes in attendance. That's when the Book of Esther starts. In the 3rd year of King Xerxes Ahasuerus's reign. So we know when Esther begins. At the 3rd chapter of Esther, in chapter 7, or verse 7, it says, in the 1st month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, Pur, that is the lot, was cast before Haman. So all this Haman story, he's the bad guy. He's Satan's man on the ground. This all happens, Esther chapter 3, all the way to the end of the chapter, only covers a very, very short period of a few weeks of Persian history. So Esther takes place after the exile. It's in the period of time after Haggai, after Zechariah, after Ezra. I'll give you another fact and then we close. I keep saying that, but we really will this time. If you're reading the book of Ezra, go into your Bibles and write this in the book of Ezra. After chapter 6 and before chapter 7, write in Esther. Because that's where Esther historically takes place. After Ezra chapter 6, before Ezra chapter 7, that is the book of Esther. Right there in that gap. Ezra chapter 6, Esther. And then Ezra chapter 7 picks up with King Artaxerxes, a different king. So now when you read your Bible, you say, oh, okay, I get it. It makes sense. It's just a story. It's a story of Israel. It's an outplaying of this story of Israel that God keeps telling. That's all that's going on here. Don't let it confuse you. So Israel is back in the land after 70 years of exile or discipline. God is satisfied when Israel again worships Him. God will be satisfied when Israel again worships Him only in the promised land, following the Mosaic law. And what we see in the book of Esther is Satan will only be satisfied when Israel's relationship with Yahweh is once again destroyed. It was destroyed for 70 years. He kicked them out of the land. And Satan wants to get back to that. The book of Esther. Let's close in prayer. Father,